My name is Eric, and I live in a small county in Wyoming where there's nothing but barren plains and distant mountains for miles. It was around 11 p.m. I was finishing my shift at the hospital and heading home when a massive blizzard hit. The snow was so thick that my old Jeep slid off the road and got buried in a snowbank near a deep ravine. I tried everything to get it out, but the engine finally gave up, leaving me stranded on that desolate highway. As the heater died, the temperature inside the car plummeted. I knew if I stayed there, I'd be frozen by morning. I remembered seeing an old, likely abandoned gas station about half a mile back. At the very least, it offered shelter. I grabbed my bag and started trekking through the life-threatening storm. The wind was so violent I could barely breathe. After 20 minutes of struggling, a faint light appeared. It was the gas station. There were no cars, and the windows of the main building were shattered. As I approached, I saw a shadow near the garage. A man was kneeling in the snow, digging into the frozen ground with his bare hands. Despite the bone-chilling cold, he was wearing nothing but a filthy t-shirt. I walked closer and called out, "Hello, are you okay? My car broke down." He didn't answer, he just kept digging. When I got right up to him, he suddenly stopped and looked at me. His face was caked with frost, but his eyes were wide open and he wasn't blinking. Next to him in the snow sat a small bag, emitting a foul, sickening odor. Instinct told me to run. As I turned to leave, two more men emerged from behind the station. They carried heavy iron chains and industrial tools. They weren't wearing masks, but their faces held a feral look, as if they were looking at prey rather than a human being. One of them pointed at me and whispered to the other, "His height is perfect." I took off in the fastest sprint of my life. I couldn't stay on the road where I'd be an easy target, so I veered into the open fields. It was 1:30 a.m. and the snow was knee-deep, making every step an agonizing struggle. I looked back and saw them following me, not frantically, but with a terrifying, organized precision, using flashlights. They weren't shouting, they were whistling to signal my location to one another. I collapsed behind a fallen tree trunk, gasping for air, my limbs going numb from the cold. One of the men stopped just a few feet from my hiding spot. He swept his light across the area, pulled out a phone, and made a call. "Yeah, we found a new one. Meet us at the lumber shed. This one's still warm." A shudder went through my body. There was someone else waiting in a vehicle. I began to crawl away, desperate to break their perimeter. As I slid down a small slope, my hand hit something hard. It was a human shoe buried in the snow, and just inches away, a frozen hand was sticking out of the ground. It wasn't just one body, there were several. These people were using the blizzards to target stranded travelers and burying them in these vast empty plains where no one would ever look. They were so close now, I could hear the crunch of their boots on the crusty snow. I remembered I had an emergency flare in my bag from the hospital's kit. As the three of them closed in on my position, I struck the flare and hurled it directly at their faces. The blinding red light stunned them for a few precious seconds. I used that window to bolt in the opposite direction. I didn't stop running until I saw the flashing lights of a police patrol car on the distant highway. I collapsed in the middle of the road, waving my arms. The officer pulled me in and wrapped me in a thermal blanket. When I told the story and we returned to the spot with backup, the scene was empty. The gas station was a shell. No men, no bag, and no bodies. The next day, the police searched the area, but they found nothing but my Jeep. However, when I got home and opened my bag, I found a small scrap of paper that must have been slipped in while I was running or during the initial encounter. It read, "You were lucky the snow picked up. Otherwise, it wouldn't have taken us long to find clothes your size. I moved out of that county the same day. Now I never venture out alone during a blizzard. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Also, let me know in the comments how you found the video. Now, let's move on to the next story.
My name is Mark, and I live alone in a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. This happened last month during a massive blizzard. The snowfall was so heavy that it was impossible to see even the street in front of my window. I decided to work from home that day because going outside would have been suicidal. By 5 p.m., the power went out, a common occurrence during such storms, so I lit a few candles and settled onto the sofa. Around 8:30 p.m., I heard a knock at my back door. My place is fairly isolated, and it seemed impossible for anyone to be out in that storm. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then the knock came again, 3 times, low and rhythmic. I worked up the courage to peek through the kitchen window. A man was standing there, wearing an old, heavy coat with his head bowed. He didn't have a car. He was just standing there in the snow. I shouted through the window, asking what he wanted, but he didn't answer. He just stood there, motionless, as if he couldn't even feel the cold. I raised my voice, telling him I couldn't open the door and that he needed to leave. After a few seconds, he lifted his head and looked at me. His face was expressionless, just a blank stare. Then he turned and walked into the whiteout, disappearing within moments. I breathed a sigh of relief and went back to the sofa. But about half an hour later, I realized I was hearing strange noises from inside the house. They were coming from the basement, the sound of someone slowly climbing the wooden stairs. My first thought was freezing pipes, but these were clearly footsteps. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was dead and the battery was at 5%. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stood by the basement door. I tried to convince myself no one could be inside since all the doors were locked, but as I listened closely, I heard heavy breathing. Someone was standing right on the other side of that door. My entire body froze. Then I remembered there's a small basement window that I might not have locked properly that morning. I quietly backed away and ran to my bedroom to lock myself in. As I was heading up the stairs, I heard the basement door creak open. The person was now inside the main house, walking slowly without any rush. I slammed my bedroom door shut and dragged a heavy wardrobe in front of it. Gasping for air, I sat in the dark, listening to the floorboards groan under his weight. He stopped right outside my door. It was 11:15 p.m. and the house was as silent as a graveyard. He didn't pound on the door or say a word. He just stood there, and his mere presence was enough to paralyze me. A few minutes later, I heard something slide under the door. I turned on my flashlight and saw a small scrap of paper. With trembling hands, I picked it up. In crude, messy pencil, it read, "Your kitchen light was on for a long time." My skin crawled. The power had been out for hours. This meant he had been watching me from the shadows, inside or outside, since last night or even earlier. He was just waiting for the blizzard so no one could come to my aid. Suddenly, my phone died, leaving me in total darkness. The howling wind outside and that horrific silence inside. Then he turned the doorknob very slowly. When he realized it was barricaded, he spoke for the first time. His voice was low and raspy, like he hadn't spoken in years. He said, "Jacob, I know you're in there. Help me move the wardrobe." My name isn't Jacob, it's Mark. That was the moment I realized he wasn't looking for me. He was looking for someone else, but he didn't care who was inside. He just wanted in. He began throwing his shoulder against the door. With every hit, the wardrobe slid back a few inches. I looked at the window, but jumping from the second floor onto frozen rocky ground was a death sentence. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the corner of the room. At 2:30 a.m., the thumping stopped. I thought he had given up, but then I heard noises from above. He was climbing onto the roof to get in through the attic. I heard him prying up the roof shingles. In many Chicago homes, there's a small attic hatch in the bedroom ceiling. I looked up. The small wooden panel began to shift. He lifted it, and there was that same face I had seen through the window, but now it wore a strange, lifeless smile. He was about to drop down when a loud horn blared from the street. It was a snowplow clearing the road. Its bright lights flooded through my window. The sudden light must have startled him or made him think the police had arrived. He retreated instantly, and I heard him running across the roof. I stayed in that corner with my bat until 7 a.m. When the sun finally rose, I pushed the wardrobe aside and walked out. The house was empty, but my wallet, which I had left in the bedroom, was sitting on the kitchen table. Nothing was missing, but it was covered in a thin layer of snow. The police arrived and found the broken basement window and boot prints on the roof, but the snow had been so heavy that the tracks vanished by the time they reached the street. They told me he was likely a drifter, but I know he wasn't just some random person. To this day, whenever it snows, I can't stop looking at my bedroom ceiling. I'm terrified that one day he'll come back looking for Jacob.
My name is David, and I live in a small town in Minnesota where the winters are so harsh they can paralyze life itself. Last December, a blizzard hit that broke every stand-in record. By 4 p.m., the snow had piled up so high that my car was completely stuck in front of the garage. I knew if I didn't clear it now, it would be buried by morning. So I put on my heavy jacket, grabbed my shovel, and headed out. The world outside was eerily silent, save for the howling wind. The street lights were dimmed by the thick snow, and visibility was down to just a few feet. I had been working for about 15 minutes when I felt eyes on me. I stopped and squinted across the street. A tall man was standing there, perfectly still. He wasn't wearing any waterproof gear. He was in a simple black suit, which was utterly bizarre for a blizzard. I waved and yelled hello, thinking he might be in trouble. He didn't respond. He just stood there. His silence unsettled me, so I went back to shoveling, but my focus stayed locked on him. A few minutes later, I looked up again. The man was now in the middle of the road, much closer than before. There was no sound to his movement, as if he were gliding over the snow. "Do you need help?" I shouted. Still silence. His face was hidden in the shadow of his hat, but I could feel his gaze burning into me. A sudden wave of panic hit me. I hoisted the shovel over my shoulder and began backing toward my front door. As soon as I moved, he accelerated. He wasn't exactly running. It was a strange, hitching lunge toward me. As I reached my porch steps, I slipped and fell. It was 6:15 p.m., and the darkness had grown thick. I looked back. The man was already in my driveway, barely 10 feet away. He didn't seem to have a weapon, but his hands were unnaturally long. his fingers twitching and curling as if practicing a grip. I scrambled up, ran inside, and bolted the door. I peered through the kitchen window. The man was now standing on my porch, pressing his face against the glass. In the dim light, I saw that his skin was bone white and pulled tight over his skull, as if there were no flesh beneath it. He began to scratch at the glass. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of nails raking against the pane, like an animal trying to tear its way in. With trembling hands, I tried to call the police, but the lines were dead from the storm. Suddenly, a violent crash of shattering glass erupted from the back of the house. He wasn't alone. I realized then that he was just a distraction. Someone else had entered through the back. I heard the unmistakable slap squelch of wet boots on the kitchen tiles. I ran and hid in my bedroom closet. My whole body was shaking, and my heart was hammering so loud I was sure they could hear it. I heard two people moving through the house now. They didn't speak. They just overturned furniture and threw things around, as if searching for something specific. Then their footsteps turned toward my bedroom. Through the slit in the closet door, I watched. It was the man in the black suit, accompanied by another figure in a slicker raincoat. The one in the raincoat held a long, rusted metal saw. They both stood by my empty bed, staring at it in silence. The one in the raincoat tilted his head, scanning every corner of the room. His gaze landed on the closet and stopped. They began to walk toward the closet, inch by inch. I closed my eyes and said a final prayer. But at that exact moment, the piercing wail of an ambulance siren echoed from the street. There must have been an accident nearby in the town. The sound made them freeze instantly. The man in the suit grabbed the other's arm and gestured toward the window. They vanished from the room as silently as they had entered. I sat in that closet for 2 hours until the storm died down. When I finally found the courage to come out, the back door was wide open and a drift of snow had piled into the kitchen. There were wet footprints everywhere, but alongside them were small droplets of blood that didn't seem to belong to them. The tracks led out into the snow, where they vanished into the whiteout. I packed a bag and ran toward the main road where I could find people. I never went back to that house. The police found no one, but they told me the footprints they did find were far larger than any normal human foot. Even today, when it snows, I can still hear the sound of nails scratching against the glass, and I know those things are still out there, waiting for the next person to step outside.